Hi, everyone. Welcome to my podcast, When Tech Meets Ed. I'm Professor Jie Ren. I'm very happy to have my PhD advisor, Dr. Jeff Nickerson, to join us to discuss a very important and interesting topic, AI persona. I know Jeff recently went to Busan for a conference. So, Jeff, tell us about the Busan trip.
Yeah, so I went to a conference in Busan called the User Interface Software and Technology Conference. It's an ACM conference.
Amazing.
Mainly computer scientists who are building things. And I was part of the organization for a workshop on longitudinal research in AI.
Oh, cool.
Tao Long at Columbia ran this workshop. And it was very interesting because a lot of the conversation was, does it even make sense to do longitudinal research in AI because things are changing so rapidly? One of the points that many people at the workshop made is that it is changing very rapidly. And yet, since it's going to be maybe the future of the way we work, it's probably quite important to not just have 5 or 10 minute interactions with AI and write papers about it, but to maybe have interactions with AI over days, weeks, and months, and start to understand how it changes the way we interact, the way we work.
That is amazing. I know we're going to talk about AI persona, but given what you have described, right, I want to take a little bit shift in terms of, like AI models are being advanced so quickly, et cetera, et cetera. So what do you detect issues or, good things related to one AI model? The good things will stay there, but the problems or something, they will disappear. So that definitely will change, how we use, for example, AI persona and agents. Maybe like you can talk about it briefly, and then we can just move to, your background, etc.
Yeah. So I think one of the really interesting things, the technologies are changing very rapidly. And one of the interesting things relevant to what we're going to talk about in terms of work is that when these AI models came out, I remember a long time ago when Amazon allowed you to talk to an agent.
Yeah.
That
Alexa.
Right. Exactly. And those conversations would only last about like 20 seconds before they would go totally off track. Right.
Yeah.
And now we can have conversation with these agents that go back and forth for several minutes.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
The newest thing are agents that will go away for, say, 15 or 20 minutes, right?
Okay.
So, as example, the coding agents, I can ask, and I've been doing this. I've been doing this recently, where I've been talking to an agent, and I've been asking it to build a software system, and it will ask me a few questions. It will go away for 15 or 20 minutes, and it will build me several thousand lines of code, right?
Amazing.
So this is like really different.
Yeah.
Now, yesterday, OpenAI announced that they have a new coding agent, which they claim can go for an entire day without intervention.
Nice.
Now, I have not tried it yet. And the online conversation is a little bit skeptical that it could actually go an entire day. But I think that's the direction.
Yeah.
Is that the delegation, basically what's happening is it's like delegation with humans.
Yeah.
Is you don't want to delegate, certainly you don't want to do 30-second delegation. And even 5-minute delegation is too short. And even an hour delegation for a human being is too short. Really you want to get up to a day or ideally like a week. And so I think that's what we're headed toward, are agents where you can kind of say, hey, go off and investigate this and give me something a week later rather than give me something in like 20 minutes or so.
Nice. So given like AI agents be more and more productive, right? So definitely they can be applied to many fields more productively, right? We're going to talk about that in a bit. So now I want you to introduce yourself. You have so many titles that I don't know where to start.
So right now I'm an emeritus professor at Stevens Institute of Technology in business school. And I did many things before that. I think pertinent to our conversation is my undergraduate and first graduate degree were in visual design and graphic design. And so I have a design background. I started working with a design background, and later I went back and I got a PhD in computer science. And a lot of my work has been trying to figure out how to integrate these multiple interests that I have.
Nice. I know, like, under your supervision as a PhD student, right, I started to get into this field that is called collective intelligence and creativity. So why don't you start with that? Like, how did you start your journey on this topic?
Yeah, so I got interested in the way I got to collective creativity was the inception of it really came from a conference, the workshop on information and networks, which was held at NYU. And it was a very interesting workshop, essentially, with about 100 people every year. And it had a mix of people. It had business school people, but it also had physicists and computer scientists and sociologists who were mixing together everything they knew about networks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sociologists were working with social networks for a long period of time, but also physicists became interested in social networks because for a physicist, you have atoms and atoms are connected to each other and then you get chemistry and like that. And so for physicists, this is also a very natural thing to study. And for economists, it was also very natural to study because you have marketplaces, which essentially can be modeled as networks of individuals. So that became a place where I realized that I could do something that was pertinent to information systems that involved my interest in networks. But then I had another puzzle, is that I wasn't really interested in studying, as an example, the impacts on finance. I was much more interested in, can the networks be used to create new things? And so I found that there is an area of research called collective intelligence. And within collective intelligence, there was kind of a burgeoning area called collective creativity, which said, can we connect in the initial stages, sets of people together that were very, very large and have them create things. This was kind of the inceptions of crowdsourcing. Can you crowdsource certain aspects of things? So instead of having, one person creating something or 5 people creating something, you could have hundreds or even thousands of people creating things.
I totally agree with you because with crowd, right, it's not like one person, as you said, or a small group of people. It's like thousands of people. And how do you organize them for better outcome here, creativity, right? So now you can use the network, right, and also distribution system to organize them in different ways to see which way could better generate something, right? So can you also talk about how you focus on AI persona?
Yeah,
you see the natural kind of transitioning.
Yeah,
but I want you to elaborate.
There is a transition because as we got large language models, it started to become apparent that a lot of the things that we asked crowd workers to do, you could also ask a large language model to do. And in fact, one of the other conferences that I go to, and I'm actually on the steering committee of Collective Intelligence, took this up recently at a conference in Delft. One of the things there were 2 things that were amazing about the conference. One was that there were a lot of people who had been doing crowd work started to calibrate and go back and take all the old crowd working papers and see if you could get large language models to replicate that work. And
is it better than the crowd work or worse? What's the comparison?
Well, so the main thing is, could you get it to even do it? So that was really the thing. And if you could get it to do it, how quickly could you get it to do it? Is it more or less expensive to hire AI agents to do it? And the result at the time, so this is several years ago, the result at the time was that not all crowd work, it wasn't easy to get all crowd work replicated, but some of it you could replicate and you could do it quite quickly. And it meant that you could move more quickly because, as you know, having done crowd work, it can take you have to ask people to do it, and people not always are available, and they're
reluctant,
and you want them to come back later and do things again, and they don't want to come back, and it's hard to manage. And with crowd work, AI agents as crowd workers, is much easier to manage. So there's a sense that maybe this is possible. Then the other thing that happened, which is the most important thing for my work in Persona, is there is a workshop at the conference called Crowd Camp, And CrowdCamp has occurred at a number of different conferences. And at CrowdCamp, a set of us got together and said, could we actually could we use a large language model and create persona, have the large language model create persona that would have conversations that would be generative in some way to either solve problems or generate things. And we tried this out as a workshop. We just tried out this idea and it worked. Nice. Right. So in other words, we got like really interesting conversations out of it. And we also got productive work. And that was the moment in which myself and other people involved in it said, there's really something here. And we started saying, well, maybe these persona are kind of the equivalent of the crowd worker from before, but they have really interesting aspects to them. So as an example, what was really interesting is there were 4 of us at the time, and the 4 of us created 4 agents.
Okay.
And we asked them to do design, and we monitored their conversation. And then we ourselves, as we're monitoring, are talking among each other. So it's kind of like we have a shadow team that's doing design, and we ourselves are talking among ourselves. And then we're trying to figure out, kind of as the managers, what do we ask them to do next? And so this, in some sense, becomes a paradigm for the way one can use AI persona to do things.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's very much like AI agents, more related to the job functions, et cetera, and now you can add certain personalities and then having the conversations. Maybe they could be working individually, or they could work in a team, right? As you guys are having conversations, a human like supervisor having conversations, and then guiding this like AI agents with, different personas working together. I think that's really cool. And then I also want to talk about, so far we have talked so much about the academic kind of development and discussion on like AI persona, et cetera. I want also to talk about the commercial implications, the business implications, the use of AI personas in the business context. So for example, right, we could see, AI personas are becoming online influencers, right? Like affecting a lot of, for example, younger people on social media. And we also see the commercialization of AI personas in terms of helping me or helping anyone to learn a foreign language and practice with these users. Or it could be like AI personas, very much providing online companionship for someone who is having a bad day. So could you please elaborate on this business, applications of online personas? AI personas.
Yeah, so I think all the things you mentioned are things that are developing right now, and I think they all. I mean, we're at the early stages on all of them. One of the things one of the things I wanted to raise is that I went to one of the things I like doing is I like doing hackathons around AI, and I went to a hackathon in New York. It was part of Tech Week in New York. Well, no, actually, it was. I went to a hackathon at Tech Week, and then I went to kind of some add-on hackathons spun out of that. And one of the hackathons was run by a VC firm, and the prompt. Whenever you go to a hackathon, they give you a prompt, and you don't really know what to expect until you get the prompt. Okay. And the prompt had to do with persona.
Nice.
And I was like, oh, interesting.
Yes.
And it became evident that, that there has been a lot of work in persona in the startup community.
Okay.
And in fact, it turned out that the VC, what the VCs were really interested in was that one of the big problems with a company starting is how do you get the first few customers, right?
Yes.
Like how do you, because once you have the first few customers, then you can often spin it up.
You can scale up, right?
But
like you hope. Yes.
You hope, right? And how do you kind of get an intuition that you won't be able to just get your friends to use it?
That's true.
But
always the starting point, right?
Right. That's often the starting point, but the VCs are much more interested in, they discount that. They're much more interested in are there real people out there? Are there chief marketing officers or chief technology officers or whatever that are going to buy your product or at least are interested in your product? And so there now is a whole infrastructure around kind of what I will call customer personae And you can think about it, you think about, well, a quite obvious thing to do is if you were thinking about like a mass market retail thing is you could create people with certain demographics and see if they're interested in an ad you're going to give them. But to me, a little bit more interesting is in the business to business area. Can you create persona who are managers inside companies that can purchase technology and will they be interested in your product?
Yeah, but it sounds very much like testing the idea, right? Testing this prototype or testing this product to see what is the potential market, or is it interesting to like anyone, right? As a potential customer or potential investor. But how would we go beyond that to bring in like real customers?
So here's the kind of like I think that's that is the bridge that these companies are trying to cross. But here's kind of an interesting thing that I noticed from the conference is it turns out there's already kind of an infrastructure out there of different tools and libraries related to this. And it seems like there's two things. One is you want to be able to create a set of persona that describes, say, chief marketing officers, and you want to test your message on these chief marketing officers until you get a message that seems to resonate with the persona. Now, the question is, can you find a real person that matches the persona?
Yes.
And so there are other companies that specialize in that, right?
Nice.
So in other words, once you have a description of a persona, they will look through, say, LinkedIn profiles to try to find a profile that matches. And now you have a sales lead that might be a lot better than a typical sales lead because you've already, you kind of understand what you're looking for. You're looking for, you might be looking for a mid-market company in the Northeast that is close to a distribution center, as an example. Like these very, very specific things is what your analysis has shown is a customer that might actually be interested in your product. And now you got there and you try to find a person that is like that. And then you can send them a very targeted message saying, this is why your product will fit what they're doing. It's a lot better than a blanket, or than a blanket email or a blanket post on LinkedIn.
Yeah, it's one step further than just plainly, working on this market segmentation, trying to figure out who your customers are, right? And then in this case, you can actually do the kind of like doing the simulation, right? Using these AI personas, but actually you are matching them to real people and doing this more targeted marketing strategy.
Yes, yeah. And I'm also interested in another aspect of this, which is, so a lot of people at this hackathon seem focused on that kind of getting your first customer type of thing, which is, I think, what the VCs were focused on. But I also think there's another way you can use persona, which is in product design.
Oh,
right?
Yes. About creativity, back to creativity.
So back to creativity is so you can assemble, you might have in a startup, you might have an R&D team, which is like one or two people, right? And you want to have a larger R&D team. And so you can create persona in your R&D team to have them develop product. And if you think about it, what you're really looking for in a startup is product market fit, right? So somebody is finding a market for the product you think you have, but it's also modifying the product so it fits an existing market, right? So this thing goes both ways.
Yes.
And you can imagine if you have persona, you have customer persona, but you also have R&D persona, that you could set off this kind of back and forth to try to evolve, you evolve your product and then your market, you might evolve a product to fit a particular market, but then you might ask for a search to see if there are other markets now that you changed your product. Maybe there are other markets that you haven't seen before. Yeah. Maybe it doesn't have to be in the Northeast. Maybe it doesn't have to be near a distribution center. And so in some sense, you can go back and forth and maybe expand the universe of people that might be interested in your product by like looking at the trajectory of the product and then also looking at the kind of adjacencies in the customer profiles.
Kind of reminds me of this very optimistic view that, anyone could be leading a company with AI employees. So like, what is your view on this? It is realistic to do?
So I think it is. So one thing I think is realistic to do is to think differently about company formation because now we have AI, right? I also think that because because AI may have, I think it's already having an effect on the job market. I think that the entry-level students that are graduating from our programs are having a harder time getting initial jobs than they used to have. And I think part of that is entry-level jobs. An entry-level student is competing against AI.
Yeah.
Right. And in some cases, the companies are saying, we have AI, we don't need this entry-level employee and the 2 years worth of training.
Yeah.
We can use a more experienced employee managing an AI agent rather than managing an intern or an entry-level employee. Right. So I think in that kind of job market, if I were a student that was sending out hundreds of resumes and not getting any leads, I would form a company. Right.
Okay.
So, and I think that part of the reason I would do it is I don't need that much capital anymore to form a company.
That's very true.
I need a subscription to one or two of these services, and I need a budget for an API, and I need a decent computer, and I need a space within which to do this. But that might be all I need to kind of get things going. Now, the other question is, I still think there's skill involved, right?
Yeah.
So, in other words, working with these agents, what you find is that the more you tell them, the better you get.
Yeah.
And so, I think like thinking about education, I think one of the things we should be working with the students is getting them to get better at, like, how do you even think about, prompting an agent? If you think about persona as an example, what persona are going to be important? If you're thinking about a structure where you're going to build agents to do some of the work inside a company, like, how do you structure that? How do you delegate? What are the objectives? These kinds of things, which we talk about, which we do talk about in kind of entrepreneurship courses, I think do apply to managing AI. But I also think there are particular skills to managing AI, right? Like, I think a big difference is in a company, if you're delegating to an employee, the pace with which the employee comes back to you is relatively slow. You delegate, you ask them to come up with a few product ideas. You expect them to come back maybe in a few days to have a conversation. In this case, you're asking and getting something back very quickly. And so very quickly, it can be overwhelming the amount of reading that you need to do to even absorb and manage the AI, right? And so that's kind of like as an experience issue is, how do you get experienced enough to know, how do you give the prompts and how do you manage what's coming back? And when do you realize that maybe you're getting too much stuff back and you need to do some thinking, or maybe you figure out ways of letting the AI itself monitor its results, change its results, and redirect its results the same way a human employee would. So you're not getting back what's called kind of AI slop, but you're getting back things that are like well considered and going to be much closer to what you can act on as an entrepreneur.
So if I do a summary, right? So for example, if anyone wants to be an entrepreneur by the use of AI agents or persona, that person first needs to have a strategic vision. That's very important. And then at the same time needs to have technical abilities, right? For example, how to get connected to APIs, etc. And then the other one is very much like the soft skills that we were, like in the traditional context, educational context, right? So like anyone needs to have soft skills. But in that case, we are talking to human workers, right? Interacting with human clients, human suppliers, etc., etc. And now we need to apply that to these conversations with AI agents and AI personas, and more having a design view in terms of, how I should use these AI agents to carry these tasks, right? And maybe like from this supervisor's point of view, human supervisor's point of view, break the big task into like small pieces. Kind of like this person is wearing multiple hats, right? Doing multiple functionalities. But again, with the AI agents and personas help, that is doable.
Yes, and I think it is, as you said, like managing AI agents is a similar skill to managing humans, but there are differences, right? And in particular, one of the things that I keep on running into with AI agents is that as an example, I will ask it to build a chatbot, to build a chatbot tool. that I want to give to somebody else to use, right? So in other words, I want to build a layer on top of a chatbot that is a very focused tool. And it will build it for me. And then I will test it. And as I'm testing it, I will get a suspicion that maybe it's not what I think it is. So I'll ask it, is this actually a chatbot? Are you actually going out like I told you? Are you using my API key to go out to Anthropic? Now, are you really doing that? And it will say, yes. I'll say, because some of those replies, it seems like some of these replies seem a little bit canned. And it said, no, that's just the way it is. And then I'm like, hold on a second. And we'll go in and look at the source code. And we'll find that it's built this very elaborate conversation simulator.
Wow.
Would say 100 of kind of canned replies. And it's taken me a while for it to cycle around and start using some of the same replies. And so then I will ask it, I'll say, hey, you're actually using a simulator, right? And it goes, yes, I'm using a simulator. And if I ask it why, it'll say, well, I tried to use the API, but the API key was not accepted. So in order to make further progress and please you, I created a simulator. Okay. Now, in some ways that's right. It's trying to please me, but in other ways it's not right because I actually want I want it to do the real thing. I don't want it to create a simulation. And it doesn't seem to differentiate between the real thing and the simulation in the same way that I would. So now in my prompting, I need to say, look, if you run into an obstacle and you want to use a simulation, come back to me and kind of like ask permission before you do that, because maybe we can find a way of solving the initial problem, solving the API key problem so that we can build a real thing rather than a simulator, right? So that's very different. With a human, you ask a human to go off and do something like that, they're not going to come back and tell you that they've got it working if they've built a simulator. They'll come back to you and say, look, I built a simulator because I couldn't get that was the first thing they would tell you because they know that changes the quality of the solution. So in this way, managing AI is different because it has different, it's not grounded in the same way we are as humans. And so it becomes possible to, if you don't recognize it's going to do that, it might be possible to be talking to this thing for several days without realizing that you're not actually, you're talking to essentially a simulation rather than something doing the work that you expect it to do.
Yeah, so part of that is prompt engineering, but it's not only on that level. And then as anyone, who is thinking about using AI agents to do the job, that person also needs to be technical, right? If the job is related to technical stuff.
I think there is some level of technology that's very helpful to have. Like as an example, if you're just talking to having a conversation with these agents versus building on top of an API, you are limited to what that interface gives you. Whereas if you can build an API, you can create alternative interfaces, which allow you to tailor your solution and differentiate what you're doing from what other people are doing and maybe go deeper in certain ways. So I think being able to master the API calls is kind of important. I will say that there is if somebody says, sometimes I will talk to people who say they're not technical, and I'm like, well, the level of technology you need to master, you don't need to go back necessarily and get a PhD in computer science. What you might need to do is you might need to talk to an agent and say, hey, I need to learn how to run the API calls. Teach me enough Python to make API calls and make me and test me to see if I'm actually understanding these concepts. So you can do that. So you can master, instead of trying to master everything, you can master a particular aspect of this, and then proceed.
Okay, since we are talking about learning, for example, learning Python or learning technical stuff, I want to shift to our final question, which is both of us are educators, right? So from an educator's point of view, I know maybe not every single student wants to become an entrepreneur or at that moment, right? At this very in this very life stage, maybe a few years later, and then that student is thinking about becoming an entrepreneur. So for the students who are just graduating from these programs, right? What is your best suggestion for them to adapt to this workplace where AI agents or personas could be used?
Right. So, I think like in everything else, experience is important, right?
Mm.
And in this case, experience that's going to be super important is experience working with AI agents to build things. And so my kind of general recommendation to students and people who have recently graduated is to, you know, is to have, is to have subscriptions to, to the major models, right?
Mm.
Is to do that investment. So you're using several of the major models. And the reason to do that is they all have different qualities and they're changing at different times.
That's true.
And you can start to generalize. If you're working with more than one, you can start to generalize and you'll learn things. They'll react in different ways, and you'll just form a better image of what's going on. So for example, we have OpenAI. We have Anthropic with Claude, and we have Gemini. Gemini 3 just came out, which is getting rave reviews at the same time. So
Yes.
at least those three. And then if you're more technical, you might want to work with some of the open source models and run something locally,
Yes.
right? Because that way, when you run it locally, you can have it do things essentially for free, and you can let it do things over like much longer periods of time. So that'd be my suggestion: is to have these things and keep on working with them, having conversations. And I don't even think it matters exactly the conversations that you're going to have. You can have conversations that are like, I plan to travel to a foreign city, and I want to photograph some architecture, and where should I go? And then do planning with it and start to, and even from that, that's like that seems like it seems like it might be a frivolous use of the technology. When you think about it, it's actually planning, right?
Yeah.
And if you can start to get it to form a decent plan, it's not that far to think about, a product and the way you need to distribute a product, or you're a salesperson and who should you be visiting when you go to a particular city. These things are very intertwined. And so I think like in our everyday lives, using them in our everyday lives is actually not a bad way of getting experience with what they're good at and not good at. Because you can tell from his recommendations, if you go to the city, you try to follow his recommendations, you can see what worked and what didn't work, right? What is it very sensitive to and what is it less sensitive to?
Thank you so much, Jeff, for these wonderful insights. I really enjoyed our conversation. And I'm also looking forward to a new art piece in the future. And then hopefully, you could be, on the podcast again on art.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.